Minnesota Issues with Arthur Naftalin is produced in cooperation with the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota.
Well, welcome to Minnesota Issues. In recent years, the media in the United States, like most of our institutions, have been the subject of much critical analysis. It is widely assumed that American newspapers, radio, and television are generally free of bias and are not beholden to any particular ideology. This assumption is sharply challenged by one of my guests in this edition of Minnesota Issues. He's Noam Chomsky, member of the faculty of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an authority in the fields of linguistics, who has written many books and articles on a wide range of subjects. During spring quarter, Mr. Chomsky visited the University of Minnesota several times to lecture and to participate in a course that studied bias in the American media. We are joined by Kate Stanley, editorial writer for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, who specializes in the field of social policy, especially with respect to the law and the courts. Welcome, friends, to Minnesota Issues. Mr. Chomsky, by way of setting a proper structure for our discussion, can you provide, I know this is difficult, but could you provide us with a brief summary of your position with respect to the ideological bias of the American media?
Yes, I think one can identify a certain system of beliefs and doctrines that express what we might call a sort of state religion. It's a set of beliefs which serve to protect the interests of private and public power in this country. That means essentially the state and the private corporations. And I think we can show that in a quite extraordinary fashion, this set of beliefs provides the assumptions within which the media operate tacitly. That is, it's the set of assumptions that determines how facts are selected, which ones are suppressed, which ones are distorted, how they're distorted. It determines how questions are framed. It gives the assumptions within which reporting continues and within which debate continues. And that constitutes a bias of quite extreme proportions. The net effect of it is that we often astonishingly resemble totalitarian states in the way in which understanding is distorted and suppressed and facts are eliminated from history.
What is the character of the bias?
The bias is that there are certain centers of power in any society. In our society, it happens to be essentially the state executive and the private economy, the masters of the private economy, who are incidentally very closely linked to the state executive. Now, they have certain interests. They run the country in a certain way. They run a good part of the world in a certain way. And those interests are defended by a set of beliefs. For example, the belief that the U.S. posture in the world is defensive, or that the United States is committed to human rights and democracy and raising living standards, and a whole series of articles of faith of this kind. Now, those articles of faith are a belief system. They're totally false. They're easily refuted both by the historical record and by the documentary record. Can you characterize
what that belief system is? What is the nature of the American belief system that our press reflects with this bias?
Well, for example, the belief that the U.S. government has traditionally been concerned with human rights, democratization, and raising of the living standards. In fact, the documentary record of internal documents shows that policy planners have, for a long time, held that we should put these issues to the side and that we should be concerned with other issues, namely our own material interest. That is, we should be concerned with creating a world in which resources are free for us to rob and exploit, or the view that the American posture in world affairs is defensive. That's nonsense. No great power is ever defensive, certainly not the United States. Our posture, like that of other great powers, is aggressive, interventionist, in the interests of private power and state managers. Now, that's the set of beliefs that prevents us from perceiving this. That's a belief system, and that is internalized by the media to the extent that they cannot even perceive an American attack against another country as aggression. They perceive it as defense. So to take what's perhaps the most startling example of this, we have no difficulty in perceiving that the Russians invaded Afghanistan. Of course, they claim they were invited in, but we see through that because they installed the government that invited them in. Now, 23 years ago, we attacked South Vietnam. We installed a government to invite us in, And when that government refused to go along, we just kept replacing it and went in anyway. We began bombing South Vietnam in 1962. For the next 13 years, we carried out an extensive attack against South Vietnam. The media see it differently. For them, it's a defense of South Vietnam, just as Pravda sees what's happening in Afghanistan as defense of Afghanistan. And this is very typical, incidentally.
Maybe we can come back to the matter of Afghanistan and Vietnam, but let me just see if it's a fair summary to say that you believe that our media are so conditioned by this belief system that they actively, consciously, in a sustained way, in a continuous way, suppress and distort the information which comes to the American people. Is that
the only word that I would qualify there is consciously?
Sometimes, you don't think this is conscious?
Sometimes it is. Sometimes there are some conscious suppression of news. So, for example, I could give examples. For example, for about 2 years, the United States carried out what's now called a secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia. Now, that secret bombing was secret because the media consciously suppressed it.
In that case, it was conscious. Let me turn to Kate Stanley, if I may. I've invited Kate Stanley to join us as both a responder to questions and also as a questioner, because she participated with Mr. Chomsky, as we appreciate, in one of the debates that was conducted while you were here participating in the courts. Kate Stanley, do you sense in your work at the Minneapolis Star Tribune any conscious or unconscious, I suppose if it's unconscious, it's pretty hard to sense it, but do you sense conscious, or are you aware that you are maybe beholden to an ideology that flows from the pressures that come from our belief system?
Well, as I said to the group that we spoke to recently, what Professor Chomsky says doesn't have a whole lot to do with what I do every day. And therefore, when I examine my work, I don't know whether to compliment him for raising my consciousness or to complain about how extreme his argument is. Because what I do and what other journalists do every day is our best to gather information from as many sources as we possibly can, to call as many people as we possibly can and interview them about their opinions, which often disagree with each other, and to write the news from that kind of a factual base, or in my case, to write an editorial from that factual base. And I don't see any instance in which the state ideology or even the preset agendas of editors influence that particular process. Now, of course, when I examine the process that we use to write at the newspaper, there are some things that are clear. For instance, that what appears in the newspaper somewhat depends on what we're able to read that has been written before. It also depends on the kind of relationships that are built up within a newspaper and within a community, and therefore there are certain kinds of societal assumptions that we can't help but depend on. And of course it's true, as Professor Chomsky says, that everybody who works at a newspaper is influenced by the society in which they live. So I think he's both right and not entirely right.
Are you asserting anything more than that, Mr. Chomsky? Ms. Stanley is saying that every society has a set of beliefs, lives in a culture, that's going to condition the responses that we have as academic people, as press people, in almost all walks of life.
Sure. And
are you asserting
exactly
more than that?
Point. I'm asserting that, but that's a lot, and we should realize how much it is. See, if we're saying that we're exactly like the Soviet Union, that's saying a lot.
Is your answer to that we are?
No, it isn't. But I see the way you formulated it would suggest that. See, there's a way of reformulating this to make it appear bland, but then if you think of the consequences of that bland formulation, it's quite extreme. See, if I were to take you literally, you would be asking, are you saying that nothing more than that we are just like the Soviet Union? No, that's not what I'm saying. The Soviet Union has an official belief system. We have a belief system. Both are extremely effective in determining the perception, interpretation, and understanding of primarily the educated classes, who are the purveyors of the ideology and propaganda and also its primary victims. The mechanisms are quite different, however. It is important for us to recognize, however, and to be startled, I think, by the fact that the consequences of this in our own functioning turn out to be very similar to what they are in a totalitarian state. So, for example, to take the example I gave before, in a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union, I'm certain, without reading the press, I'm certain that Pravda never refers to the invasion of Afghanistan. I'm sure that they refer to the defense of Afghanistan against terrorist bands supported by Western imperialists. Now, that happens to be exactly the way the American press, in this case without exception, over 25 years, referred to the American attack against South Vietnam. We referred to it as the defense of South Vietnam against terrorists supported from outside.
Let's just concede for, excuse me, Kate, did you want to, go ahead.
I'm interested in your statement that dissidence is something that's really not allowed in this state religion in the United States. And I don't really think that's true. I think that your presence in this program, your presence at the University of Minnesota as a main feature in an interdisciplinary course this past quarter is an indication that the kinds of arguments you're making are rather acceptable and far more mainstream than you tend to suggest.
Well,
and I think that you can look at dozens of journalists who make the same kinds of arguments you're making right now. So how is it that they were able to escape this indoctrination system you're talking about, and how did you manage to escape?
Well, there's a lot of questions there, but first let's get the facts straight. Our system does, as I said, works quite differently from the Soviet system. So if I was in the Soviet Union, I would not be giving a course at the University of Kiev on this topic. Our system does permit, this is basically a capitalist system. That means if I want to set up a store on the corner of some street and produce automobiles and compete with General Motors, I'm allowed to do it. The state's not going to stop me. But of course, you know what the outcome of that's going to be. Well, similarly, I'm allowed to speak as much as I like, and so is the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, CBS, etc. And we know what the outcome of that's going to be. Okay. Now, the outcome, we can see what the outcome is. The outcome is that, to take again the case I mentioned, but it's quite typical, that for 25 years, not a single mainstream journal outside, you have to go way out to the margin, even dissident journals didn't do this, but certainly not a mainstream journal has ever referred to the simple fact that the United States attacked South Vietnam. Now, this is reminiscent of 1984.
Mr. Chomsky, let me just comment on that. You said that several times, and you made many references to that. You referred to the invasion of South Vietnam in 1962. Beginning after the fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, we began to provide advisors and support for the regime of South Vietnam.
That's the way the propaganda system sees it.
Well, that's what happened.
That happened only in the sense in which the Soviet Union provided advice and support for the government of Afghanistan.
Well, I happen to have been in Vietnam for 90 days as one of those advisors.
Yeah, and there are advisors from the Soviet Union and Afghanistan too, except we perceive what those advisors are. We perceive that they're part of a system of domination and control, and the same was true of you in South Vietnam.
Well,
in fact, at the time, what years were you in South Vietnam?
I was there in 57.
Okay, in 1957, there was mass slaughter going on in South Vietnam, organized and conducted by the American command. By 1961, it had led to the slaughter of about 70,000 peasants.
I think the retrospective view of that is that there was more going on than I knew about at the time.
Yes, and that's what was going on, and we know that now. We know it from government sources.
I don't really want to push too hard on this question of Vietnam, because I would concede that the CIA and the national government, the American government were engaged in activities which were covert. There's no question about that.
Well, they were covert because the press wouldn't report them.
To say it was an invasion, I think, is to.
No, let me be precise. I didn't say there was an invasion in 1957. In 1957, what there was mass terrorism conducted by the United States through a client government that it installed. The attack against South Vietnam started in 1962. That's when the U.S. Air Force began extensive bombing of South Vietnam as part of a program to drive several million people into concentration camps. Now, that's an invasion. That invasion then extended for the next several years, and by 1965, it became an outright land invasion attacking South Vietnam.
I'm sorry, I didn't really mean to get onto an argument about that particular point. I'm really trying to establish in this discussion the character of this ideological bias. Let's just for the moment concede that there is this bias there. I want to ask this question. What do we do to counteract it? How do we rise above this?
How do we rise above it? Well, the first thing that's required is a certain degree of intellectual honesty. That is, a willingness to challenge the assumptions that we take for granted. So any journalist incidentally, I don't mean simply to speak of journalism. Scholarship is not very different, and intellectual life in general is not very different. But we have to ask about fundamental assumptions. So, for example, take the way in which modern history is described. Modern history is described as a period, take the course of American foreign policy. How's it described? There's supposed to have been We began with containment, and we were involved in a process of containment up until 1970 approximately. And then we turned to détente, and that didn't work, so we're now back to a form of containment. That's the official description. That dominates discussion. But notice the assumptions there. The assumptions are that someone else is aggressive, and we're just containing their aggression. Our posture is a defensive, reactive one. Now, any person of intellectual honesty ought to be asking whether that's true. And as soon as you begin to look, you find out it's not true at all. Or take, say, the arms race. I mean, there's an official ideology which says we produce arms out of for defense.
Let me interrupt to put my question again. How do we counteract this?
By being honest.
Is there a failure on the part of our schools of journalism?
That's not journalism. It starts from kindergarten.
Your attack, though, seems to it is leveled very heavily against the New York Times and the Washington Post and other what you call mainstream journals. And you seem to put in one category almost all of the correspondents, as though they are consciously...
There are a lot of very good correspondents, and a lot of them are very frustrated people, because there are many correspondents who understand a lot of things. In fact, a lot of my own information, I should say, comes from foreign correspondents who can't print it in their own newspapers.
Let me turn to Kate about that. Do you have a sense of suppression? Do you think that there's some kind of suppression that goes on at your paper, or generally through the mainstream of American journalism?
No, of course I don't. But it is true that a lot of the national and international news that we print at the Star Tribune comes through the wire services. And there is that phenomenon called groupthink, which I think Professor Chomsky means to refer to in his argument, that means that it's difficult to be very much ahead of or behind the pack in writing about a matter of international interest. And I think that has an effect on how journalists work. It means that journalists in the field are afraid that their editor is going to say, why did you write about this, and why haven't I read about it anywhere else? That's the sort of thing that Timothy Krause talked about in The Boys on the Bus in a recent presidential campaign. So I think there are pressures that cause international news to have a sameness and to kind of cause individual journalists to have to stick their necks out in order to publish the truth.
It's not a matter of groupthink, though. It's a matter of a party line. See, if we were talking about the Soviet Union, we wouldn't put it in those terms. There's a party line. For example, the party line says that what the United States does is search for peace. So, for example, say move to some other area, say the Middle East. The newspapers, the major newspapers, the ones that craft the news, that means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the wire services, and so on. Those are the sources you draw from. They define a certain a process which they call the peace process, and they ask who's in favor of the peace process and who's against the peace process. Well, it turns out, not surprisingly, that the United States is in favor of the peace process. In fact, and the various Arab states and the PLO are against the peace process. Therefore, it follows that they're against peace and we're for peace. This is all a joke. The peace process is defined as the policy of the U.S. government. So, for example, when other states, like, say, Jordan, or when the PLO produces, or say the Soviet Union, when they produce a proposal for peace in the Middle East, that's regarded as opposition to the peace process in the press. And then you pick it up and report it that way. Or take, say, Central America. For example, yesterday, there was a report from Washington by a Star Tribune journalist who described, it was very kind of interesting to see how he described government policy. He said government policy is now an effort to try to cause the Nicaraguans to moderate their behavior. And he then went on to say that the United States government is trying to induce a change in the government of Nicaragua. Now, those are very interesting statements. To assume that the United States government is trying to, how would we feel if we read in Pravda that the purpose of the Soviet government is thinking of methods of force and embargo in order to force Denmark to moderate its behavior? I mean, we'd laugh, you know? And it's just as ridiculous in this case. Now, that's an example of the, because we're attacking Nicaragua. You know, it's we who have to moderate our behavior. Or his reference to it was interesting that he referred to the fact openly that the United States is trying to bring about a change in the government of Nicaragua. Well, that happens to be illegal. It's illegal under American law, and it's illegal under international law. So here he is accusing the leadership of the United States government of being criminals, in fact, war criminals. and he doesn't notice it, and you don't notice it, and the readers don't notice it. Now that's an example of indoctrination of a very profound sort.
Yes, but we're talking about indoctrination, and you seem to say that the solution to that is intellectual honesty. Now, how is such a thing possible, given the absolute nature of the phenomenon you're talking about? How are you going to manage it?
You got to start by learning techniques of intellectual self-defense, such as the ones I've just been describing. Consider the assumptions that you take for granted, and develop the intellectual honesty and moral courage to ask whether they are true.
Mr. Chomsky,
and when you ask whether they're true, you'll find that they're not true.
Are you asserting, this is one of Ms. Stanley's questions to you and one of the discussion you had, what made it possible for you to rise above this when these other journalists somehow are either oblivious to it or unconsciously victims of it?
First of all, lots of journalists understand a good deal. It doesn't get into the press.
But then I've got to stop you at this point and say,
and look,
if they understand it, then you're saying that it's a conscious conspiracy.
At the editorial level, at the major centers of news, it is also a conscious conspiracy.
You think it's a conscious conspiracy?
In part. Well, it's a mixture.
And what are we going to do about that?
That requires institutional change and pressure. For example, when the New York Times decided consciously to suppress the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, there's no point raising their consciousness. They were doing it consciously. That requires mass popular pressure to try to force the ideological institutions to be honest. But the much more interesting fact, and much more pervasive one, is the indoctrination which leads us to automatically make certain assumptions about the world and about our role in it, and assumptions which distort our very perception of fact. That's sort of beyond Orwell, you know. And that's what we live in. And the way to deal with that, now, you asked how I happen to avoid it. As well, you know, that's a matter of personal history. I mean, it happens.
Well, I'm curious to know about
what the
that
personal history is. Well, you know, I mean, I grew up, I was a child in the 1930s. And I happen to have lived in a very politicized environment. My family, not my immediate family, but my uncles and so on, were Jewish working class in New York. And that was a very live intellectual and political environment, and I was affected by it. When I was 11 or 12 years old, I was cruising around 4th Avenue bookstores and anarchist offices picking up pamphlets. In fact, my first political article, I think, was in 6th grade after the fall of Barcelona, and it's sort of on from there, you know. But that's personal history. And the personal history happens to have been one that created for me a system of intellectual self-defense, which enables me to see lots of things which in fact are obvious truths. Now, most people go through a system of indoctrination, beginning with childhood, through the schools, through the universities, through the media, and so on, which never raises questions for them.
You would assert that you're free of bias?
No, of course I'm not free of bias. In fact, I try to express
your own biases.
Oh, well, I try to make it very plain in everything I write and speak. I try to make my bias on my, you know, so you can see it right openly. I mean, I am an opponent of authoritarian structures. I'm basically an anarchist. I'm opposed to hierarchic authoritarian structures of domination and control, whether they're in personal life or public life or economic life or whatever. And in my view, to understand any society, including our own society, you begin by asking, where does power lie over the decisions that determine how that society works? Who decides where investment takes place? Who decides what's produced?
I guess the interesting question for me in that regard is, how do you translate the anarchist position into political action?
Well, that's the way I spend my life. You know,
but
I spend my life in attempts to educate and organize and protest and demonstrate. I was just in jail a couple of weeks ago. I mean, most of my life outside of my academic life is engagement in popular political action. Education and organization.
I'm interested in your ultimate vision, because your criticism, really, it seems to me, is of the state and only of the ideological biases of the press, as they are a subset of the state's domination. No matter how much intellectual honesty you can cultivate among the few journalists, I don't see how that's going to have an effect on the profound problem that you see in the state. So what is it that you want to happen, and how's it going to happen?
Well, let me first qualify that slightly. I would say that too, but by the state I mean the system of public and private institutional power. So I'd include GM as part of the state. Yeah, so yeah, in that sense, yeah. Well, first of all, let me say I don't spend much time talking to journalists. This happens to be unusual. I'm usually talking to as much of the public as I can reach. In my view, what's needed and what's missing in the United States is an interesting country. It's different from many others, and even similar capitalist democracies. It's different for one thing in that there's a very high level of class consciousness on the part of the business classes. This is reflected in all sorts of ways, like the public relations industry, which is a system of mind control and was designed for that before the First World War. Very sophisticated in the United States, beyond that of any other country. On the other hand, there's a very low level of class consciousness and awareness on the part of most of the rest of the country. This is one of the few societies that has very few systems of organization. There's no way for people to participate in the political process. There are no parties here. The United States has two factions of the Tory party. That's incidentally why much of the population doesn't bother voting. About half the population doesn't vote in presidential elections because they're disenfranchised. In fact, they were largely the poor. Say, among unemployed people, only about a third even bothered to vote in the last election. Now, there is no way, if a democracy is going to function, there must be a way in which isolated individuals can pool their resources to confront centralized systems of power. There must be ways in which isolated individuals can come together to gain information, to form ideas, to develop political plans, to put them on the agenda, to pursue them. We don't have any such organizations.
I'm sorry, we only got about a minute left. What is your prescription or your recipe for how you do aggregate power to accomplish the ends that you have in mind?
Yeah, now we have a specific form of aggregation of power here. It's essentially in the private economy and the state executive, which is closely related to it.
How would you change that?
By developing popular organizations in which people can participate and pool their resources to become politically active.
And you feel that opportunity is now denied?
It's not denied by force. It's denied by a whole complicated system of institutional and cultural practices, and it can be changed.
Do you think there are other societies in which that expression is more possible, that participation on the part of people is more free, more open in some other systems?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's not greatly different, but almost every European country, for example, every European capitalist democracy has a labor-based political party. You know, it's sometimes called labor, or sometimes socialist, or sometimes communist.
So you would say,
or whatever.
compared to Western European countries, we're less free than they are there.
It's not that we're less free. It's that we have less institutional structure that permits public participation in political process.
I'm sorry, our time has run out. I want to thank you both very much. Noam Chomsky, a professor of linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Kate Stanley, editorial writer for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Thank you both very much for appearing with me on Minnesota Issues. I'm Arthur Naftalin. I'll be back next week with another Minnesota issue. I hope you'll join me.